Welcome to another flavor of fun episode. Today I welcome you to join me as we take a historic journey detailing the explorations and settlement of the Arctic. The Arctic is a polar region located at the northernmost part of Earth. The Arctic consists of the Arctic Ocean, adjacent seas, and parts of Canada, Denmark, Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Murmansk, Siberia, Nenets Okrug, Novaya Zemlya, Sweden, and the United States, Alaska. Land within the Arctic region has seasonally varying snow and ice cover, with predominantly treeless permafrost, permanently frozen underground ice, containing tundra. Arctic seas contain seasonal sea ice in many places. The Arctic region is a unique area among Earth's ecosystems. The cultures in the region and the Arctic indigenous peoples have adapted to its cold and extreme conditions. Life in the Arctic includes zooplankton and phytoplankton, fish and marine mammals, birds, land animals, plants and human societies. Arctic land is bordered by the subarctic. The word Arctic comes from the Greek word Arctikos, near the bear, northern, and from the word Arctus, meaning bear. The name refers either to the constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear, which is prominent in the northern portion of the celestial sphere, or to the constellation Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, which contains the celestial North Pole, currently very near Polaris, the current North Pole star, or North Star. There are a number of definitions of what area is contained within the Arctic. The area can be defined as north of the Arctic Circle, the approximate southern limit of the midnight sun and the polar night. Another definition of the Arctic, which is popular with ecologists, is the region in the northern hemisphere where the average temperature for the warmest month, July, is below 10 degrees Celsius. The northernmost tree line roughly follows the isotherm at the boundary of this region. Exploration. Historical records suggest that humankind have explored the northern extremes since 325 BC, when the ancient Greek sailor Pytheas reached a frozen sea while attempting to find a source of the metal we call tin. Dangerous oceans and poor weather conditions often fetter explorers attempting to reach polar regions, and journeying through these perils by sight, boat, and foot has proven difficult. Indo-European hypothesis. A controversial hypothesis, often regarded as pseudo-history, sets the home of the mythical people Hyperboreans in the Arctic. The scientist and author John G. Bennett talked about it in his research paper, The Hyperborean Origin of the Indo-European Culture, 1963. The theory was originally put forth by William F. Warren, the first president of Boston University, in his Paradise Found, or the Cradle of the Human Race at the North Pole. Later, Indian independence activist Bal Gangadhar Tilak resurrected Warren's theory in his The Arctic Home in the Vedas, 1903, which was dedicated to philologist and Indologist Max Muller, with whom Tilak had shared ideas before the book was completed. Austro-Hungarian ethnologist Karl Penka also discussed the same idea in his Origins of the Aryans, 1883. Tilak's theory was popularized by Russian nationalists, due to the work of Soviet historian and ethnographer Natalia Romanovna Guseva and Soviet ethnographer S.V. Jarnikova, who argued for a northern Urals Arctic homeland of the Indo-Aryan and Slavic people. Hindu nationalist Madhavrao Sadashivrao Golwalkar also supported and was inspired by Tilak's idea. In his famous 1939 publication We or Our Nationhood Defined, he stated that undoubtedly, we, Hindus, have been in undisputed and undisturbed possession of this land for over 8 or even 10,000 years before the land was invaded by any foreign race. Ancient Greek historian and geographer Herodotus said that the Hyperboreans lived beyond the Massagetae and Isodones. Since these are both Central Asian peoples, one could speculate that his Hyperboreans lived in Siberia. In his 12 labors, Heracles sought the golden-antlered hind of Artemis in Hyperborea. Since the reindeer is the only deer species of which females bear antlers, this would suggest an Arctic or subarctic region. Scholar James D. P. Bolton instead located the Isidones people on the southwestern slopes of the Altai Mountains, which led his colleague Carl P. Ruck to place Hyperborea beyond the Dzungarian Gate into the northern part of the Xinjiang region, adding that the Hyperboreans were probably Chinese. Ancient Greece. Some scholars believe that the first attempts to penetrate the Arctic Circle can be traced to ancient Greece and the sailor Pythias, a contemporary of Aristotle and Alexander the Great, who, in 325 BC, attempted to find the source of the tin that would sporadically reach the Greek colony of Massilia on the Mediterranean coast. Sailing past the Pillars of Hercules, he reached Brittany and then Cornwall, eventually circumnavigating the British Isles. From the local population, he heard news of the mysterious land of Thule, even farther to the north. After 6 days of sailing, he reached land at the edge of a frozen sea, described by him as curdled, and described what is believed to be the aurora and the midnight Sunday. Some historians claim that this new land of Thule was either the Norwegian coast or the Shetland Islands based on his descriptions and the trade routes of early British sailors. While no one knows exactly how far Pythias sailed, he may have crossed the Arctic Circle. Nevertheless, his tales were regarded as fantasy by later Greek and Roman authorities, such as the geographer Strabo. The Middle Ages. Nadad is said to have encountered Iceland when he lost his route due to harsh conditions when sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands in the 860s. In the 10th century, Guðbjörn Ulfsson got lost in a storm and ended up within sight of the Greenland coast. His report spurred Eric the Red, an outlawed chieftain, to establish a settlement there in 985. While they flourished initially, these settlements eventually petered out until about 1450. Initially, this abandonment of the colony was credited to the Little Ice Age, but that has been disputed by recent studies which suggest there were more complex factors at play. Greenland's early settlers sailed westward, in search of better pasturage and hunting grounds. Modern scholars debate the precise location of the new lands of Vinland, Markland, and Helluland that they discovered. The Scandinavian peoples also pushed farther north into their own peninsula by land and by sea. As early as 880, the Viking Othir of Halogaland rounded the Scandinavian peninsula and sailed to the Kola Peninsula and the White Sea. The Peshinga monastery on the north of Kola Peninsula was founded by Russian monks in 1533. From their base at Kola, the Pomus explored the Barents region, Spitsbergen, and Novaya Zemlya, all of which are in the Arctic Circle. They also explored north by boat, discovering the Northern Sea route, as well as penetrating to the Transural areas of northern Siberia. Pomus founded the settlement of Mangazaya east of the Yamal Peninsula in the early 16th century. In 1648, the Cossack Semyon Desnyov opened the now famous Bering Strait between America and Asia. Russian settlers and traders on the coasts of the White Sea, the Pomus, had been exploring parts of the Northeast Passage as early as the 11th century. By the 17th century, they established a continuous sea route from Arkhangelsk as far east as the mouth of Yenisei. This route, known as Mangazaya Seaway, after its eastern terminus, the trade depot of Mangazaya, was an early precursor to the Northern Sea route. Age of Discovery. Exploration to the north of the Arctic Circle in the Renaissance was both driven by the rediscovery of the classics and the national quests for commercial expansion, and hampered by limits in maritime technology, lack of stable food supplies, and insufficient insulation for the crew against extreme cold. Renaissance advancements in cartography. Patent from King Henry VII, authorizing John Cabot and his sons to explore new lands in the West. A seminal event in Arctic exploration occurred in 1409, when Ptolemy's Geographia was translated into Latin, thereby introducing the concepts of latitude and longitude into Western Europe. As a result, navigators were better able to chart their positions. The Inventio Fortunata, a lost book, describes in a summary written by Jacobus Knoyen but only found in a letter from Gerardus Mercator, voyages as far as the North Pole. One widely disputed claim is that two brothers from Venice, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, allegedly made a map of their journeys to that region, which were published by their descendants in 1558. Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans via the Arctic Ocean. Since the discovery of the American continent was the product of the search for a route to Asia, exploration around the northern edge of North America continued for the Northwest Passage. John Cabot's initial failure in 1497 to find a Northwest Passage across the Atlantic led the British to seek an alternative route to the east. Interest rekindled in 1564 after Jacques Cartier's discovery of the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Martin Frobisher had formed a resolution to undertake the challenge of forging a trade route from England westward to India. From 1576 to 1578, he took 3 trips to what is now the Canadian Arctic in order to find the passage. Frobisher Bay is named after him. In July 1583, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who had written a treatise on the discovery of the passage and was a backer of Frobisher's, claimed the territory of Newfoundland for the English crown. In 1585, under the employ of Elizabeth I, the English explorer John Davis entered Cumberland Sound, Baffin Island. Davis rounded Greenland before dividing his 4 ships into separate expeditions to search for a passage westward. Though he was unable to pass through the icy Arctic waters, he reported to his sponsors that the passage they sought is a matter nothing doubtful, and secured support for 2 additional expeditions, reaching as far as Hudson Bay. Though England's efforts were interrupted in 1587 because of the Anglo-Spanish War, Davis's favorable reports on the region and its people would inspire explorers in the coming century. In 1609, while in the service of the Dutch East India Company, the English explorer Henry Hudson sailed up what is now called the Hudson River in search of the passage. He reached present-day Albany, New York, before giving up. He later explored further north into the Arctic and Hudson Bay for the passage. The Northeast Passage. The Northeast Passage is a broad term for any route lying above the Eurasian continent and stretching between the waters north of the Norwegian Sea to the Bering Strait. The Northern Sea Route is defined as a specific portion of such routes. The Northern Sea Route, as currently officially defined by Russian Federation law, includes shipping lanes falling within Russia's EEZ and extending from the Kara Sea to the Bering Strait along the Russian northern coast. The idea to explore this region was initially economic, and was first put forward by Russian diplomat Dmitry Gerasimov in 1525. The entire route laid in Arctic waters and parts and was usually covered in ice, making it a very perilous journey. In the mid-16th century, John Cabot's son Sebastian helped organize just such an expedition, led by Sir Hugh Willoughby and Richard Chancellor. Willoughby's crew was shipwrecked off the Kola Peninsula, where they eventually died of scurvy. Chancellor and his crew made it to the mouth of the Dvina River and the town of Arkhangelsk, where they were met by a delegation from the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible. Brought back to Moscow, he launched the Muscovy Company, promoting trade between England and Russia. This diplomatic course allowed British ambassadors such as Sir Francis Cherry the opportunity to consolidate geographic information developed by Russian merchants into maps for British exploration of the region. Some years later, Stephen Burrough, the master of Chancellor's ship, made it as far as the Kara Sea, when he was forced to turn back because of icy conditions. Western parts of the passage were simultaneously being explored by northern European countries like England, the Netherlands, Denmark and Norway, looking for an alternative seaway to China and India. Most notable is the 1596 expedition led by Dutch navigator Willem Barents, who discovered Spitsbergen and Bear Island. Fearing English and Dutch penetration into Siberia, Russia closed the Mangazaya Seaway in 1619. Polar activity in northern Asia declined, and the bulk of exploration in the 17th century was carried out by Siberian Cossacks, sailing from one river mouth to another in their Arctic-worthy Kos. In 1648, the most famous of these expeditions, led by Fedor Alexeyev and Semyon Desnev, sailed east from the mouth of Kolyma to the Pacific and doubled the Chukchi Peninsula, thus proving that there was no land connection between Asia and North America. 80 years after Desnev, in 1728, another Russian explorer, Danish-born Vitus Bering on Sviatoy Gavril, made a similar voyage in reverse, starting in Kamchatka and going north to the passage that now bears his name, Bering Strait. It was Bering who gave their current names to Diomede Islands, discovered and first described by Desnev. It was not until in 1878 that Finnish-Swedish explorer Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld made the first complete passage of the Northeast Passage from west to east, in the Vega expedition. The ship's captain on this expedition was Lieutenant Louis Palander of the Swedish Royal Navy. Northwest Passage. In the first half of the 19th century, parts of the Northwest Passage were explored separately by a number of different expeditions, including those by John Ross, William Edward Parry, James Clark Ross, and overland expeditions led by John Franklin, George Back, Peter Warren Dease, Thomas Simpson, and John Ray. Sir Robert McClure was credited with the discovery of the Northwest Passage by sea in 1851 when he looked across M'Clure Strait from Banks Island and viewed Melville Island. However, the strait was blocked by young ice at this point in the season, and not navigable to ships. The only usable route, linking the entrances of Lancaster Sound and Dolphin and Union Strait, was first used by John Ray in 1851. Ray used a pragmatic approach of traveling by land on foot and dog sled, and typically employed less than 10 people in his exploration parties. The Northwest Passage was not completely conquered by sea until 1906, when the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who had sailed just in time to escape creditors seeking to stop the expedition, completed a 3-year voyage in the converted 47-ton herring boat GJA. At the end of this trip, he walked into the city of Eagle, Alaska, and sent a telegram announcing his success. His route was not commercially practical. In addition to the time taken, some of the waterways were extremely shallow. Knud Rasmussen, 1879–1933, led several Arctic expeditions. He grew up in Greenland speaking Greenlandic and Danish, and has been called the "father of Eskimology," and was the first Greenlander of Inuit and European descent to cross the Northwest Passage via dog sled. Rasmussen and his friend Peter Freuchen participated in 7 Thule expeditions, named after Ultima Thule, and wrote numerous books on their Arctic experiences. The North Pole. On April 6, 1909, Robert Peary claimed to be the first person in recorded history to reach the North Pole, although whether he actually reached the pole is disputed. He traveled with the aid of dog sleds and 3 separate support crews who turned back at successive intervals before reaching the pole. Many modern explorers, including Olympic skiers using modern equipment, contend that Peary could not have reached the pole on foot in the time he claimed. A number of previous expeditions set out with the intention of reaching the North Pole but did not succeed, that of British naval officer William Edward Parry in 1827, the tragic American Polaris expedition under Charles Francis Hall in 1871, the ill-fated Jeannette expedition commanded by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander George W. DeLong in 1879, and the Norwegian Frem expedition of Fridtjof Nansen in 1895. American Frederick Cook claimed to have reached the North Pole in 1908, but this has not been widely accepted. On May 9, 1926, Americans Richard E. Byrd and Floyd Bennett claimed to have flown over the North Pole in a Fokker F.VIIA-3M trimotor monoplane. However, their claim to have reached the pole is disputed. The crew of the airship Norge, including Roald Amundsen and the American sponsor Lincoln Ellsworth, flew over the pole on May 12, 1926. This is the first undisputed sighting of the pole. Norge was designed and piloted by the Italian Umberto Nobile, who overflew the pole a second time on May 24, 1928. Nobile's second trip was in the airship Italia that ran into a storm on the return trip and crashed on the ice. Survivors were eventually recovered. Amundsen disappeared, with the crew of his seaplane, during the rescue operations. The first people to have without doubt walked on the North Pole were the Soviet Party of 1948 under the command of Alexander Kuznetsov, who landed their aircraft nearby and walked to the pole. On August 3, 1958, the American submarine USS Nautilus, SSN 571, reached the North Pole without surfacing. It then proceeded to travel under the entire polar ice cap. On March 17, 1959, the USS Skate, SSN 578, surfaced on the North Pole and dispersed the ashes of explorer Sir Hubert Wilkins. These journeys were part of military exploration stimulated by the Cold War context. On April 19, 1968, Ralph Plaisted reached the North Pole via snowmobile, the first surface traveler known with certainty to have done so. His position was verified independently by a U.S. Air Force meteorological overflight. In 1969, Wally Herbert, on foot and by dog sled, became the first man to reach the North Pole on muscle power alone, on the 60th anniversary of Robert Peary's famous but disputed expedition. The The first persons to reach the North Pole on foot, or skis, and return with no outside help, no dogs, airplanes, or resupplies were Richard Webber, of Canada, and Misha Malakhov, of Russia, in 1995. No one has completed this journey since. U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Joseph O. Fletcher and Lieutenant William Pershing Benedict landed a plane at the pole on May 3, 1952, accompanied by the scientist Albert P. Crary. On the 2nd of May 2007, BBC's Top Gear reached the 1996 position of the magnetic North Pole in a modified Toyota Hilux. On the 2nd of August 2007, during Arctica 2007, Russian manned submersibles were the first to descend to the seabed below the pole. On April 26, 2009, Vasily Elegin, Afanasy Makovnev, Vladimir Obikhod, Sergei Larin, Alexei Ushakov, Alexei Shkrabkin and Nikolai Nikolshin, after 38 days and over 1,200 miles, starting from Sredny Island, Severnaya Zemlya, drove two Russian-built cars, named Yemelya-1 and Yemelya-2, to the North Pole. Settlements. In northernmost North America, only mainland Alaska and a small northwestern corner of Canada remained largely unglaciated during the latest ice age of the Pleistocene, about 2,600,000 to 11,700 years ago. These areas were joined to northeastern Asia, also largely without ice, across land exposed by low sea levels at what is now the Bering Strait. To the east and south, the way into the North American continent was blocked with ice and unnegotiable terrain from about 25,000 to 11,000 BCE. The earliest residents of the American Arctic are known from this area of ice-free Alaska and northwest Canada. They arrived as early as perhaps 12,000 BCE and can be referred to as members of the Paleoarctic cultural tradition. They made cutting implements in a style common to Northeast Asia that was characterized by slender flakes struck from specially prepared stone cores, flakes referred to by archaeologists as blades, many of them small, less than 5 centimeters in length, and classed as microblades. Some of these blades were apparently set into the edges of bone or antler battens, thus forming knives or projectile heads. With the latter, the Paleoarctic people hunted terrestrial animals. Caribou appear to have been their preferred food, although they also hunted elk, forms of bison now extinct, and perhaps mammoths. Blade and microblade tools had appeared earlier on the Asian side of the North Pacific, notably in Siberia and in portions of the Japanese islands. Evidence from those regions also suggests a reliance on terrestrial, rather than coastal, resources. In approximately 11,000 BCE, as the thawing of the ice caps began to open access to the rest of North America and to flood the land bridge to Asia, a change occurred in sites in North Alaska. The production of microblades decreased, while small projectile points or knife blades of stone, more fully shaped by chipping than were the microblades, appeared. Some archaeologists have attempted without appreciable success to find the beginning of this change in northeast Siberia. Others have suggested that it represents a development within the early Paleoarctic tradition itself, or that it is in fact a reflection of people already in the American heartland to the southeast, although the time and manner of their arrival there remains unknown at this time. In any event, by 10,000 BCE there was a resurgence of the microblade-producing sites of the Paleoarctic tradition. In northern Alaska at the same time there also appeared stone spear points that bear a striking resemblance to the artifacts known from the same period in other parts of North America. Like its southern counterparts, this material culture and its makers are referred to as Paleo-Indian. Most archaeologists presume the Arctic Paleo-Indians were a new influx of people who moved north from regions to the southeast, probably following, and hunting, herds of bison and other animals as they expanded into the areas where the ice had retreated. That they were in some way descended from people present in Alaska in that earlier interval when microblades were uncommon seems possible but is yet to be demonstrated. The sites used by the Paleoarctic, microblade, and Paleo-Indian, spearpoint, cultures are in somewhat different areas, and so these groups are thought to have been distinct peoples. By at least 8,000 BCE the presence of Paleoarctic people can be recognized on the Alaska Peninsula in southern mainland Alaska. At almost exactly the same moment, their characteristic microblade tools appear in a few sites on the coast in southeastern Alaska and British Columbia, suggesting a movement of Paleoarctic descendants south. When microblades appear on the central coast of British Columbia, they are found at sites that include distinctively different artifacts. This seems to indicate that the Paleoarctic people met with others who were already living in the area. Although food remains from this period are seldom preserved, evidence indicates that the transition from a terrestrial subsistence economy to one based on oceanside resources was complete within a millennium. Beginning about 7000 BCE, sites with blades and microblades appear in the eastern Aleutian Islands. Although food remains are lacking in these sites, it is clear that the occupants lived on ocean resources, as there are no other resources present in any significant quantity. Notably, all of these Paleoarctic-related appearances on the coast, of both islands and mainland, occur south of the regions in which coastlines freeze fast during the winter. The end of the Paleoarctic tradition occurred about 5500 BCE. Certainly by 5000 BCE the signs of remnant Paleoarctic-related people had been eclipsed both in the interior and on the southern coast. In the interior, new styles of artifacts constitute the Northern Archaic tradition. In general, Northern Archaic sites are located within what were the expanding northern forests. Although some Northern Archaic people left traces outside the forest limits, they generally avoided the coasts. Their artifacts include fairly large chipped stone points with stems or notches near the point's base. Stemming and notching both facilitate hafting a point to its shaft. Northern Archaic food resources were terrestrial. If the sequence of major tool types in the American Arctic is analogous to that represented to the south, this tradition may have developed from the earlier Paleo-Indian culture of the north, although direct evidence for this has thus far not been presented. By 5000 BCE, changes are also seen at sites along parts of the northernmost Pacific coast, including the eastern Aleutians, where the sea remains open in winter. These sites are characterized by new kinds of artifacts, notably large stone projectile points, stone basins for burning sea mammal oil, and harpoon heads of bone. When combined with evidence from food remains, these materials clearly indicate that local residents relied heavily upon marine mammals, including those that required the use of boats well offshore. Scholars have not reached consensus on a name for the people represented by this new material culture, but some have referred to them as members of the Ocean Bay tradition. Up to about 4000 BCE this tradition was common to the residents of the Kodiak region and the Aleutian Islands. Shortly thereafter, however, these two groups began to develop in different directions. People in the Aleutians carried aspects of Ocean Bay technology with them as they moved farther and farther west through the chain of islands, arriving at the most distant islands, Agatu and Attu, not later than about 600 BCE. On the Pacific coast around Kodiak, on the other hand, the people began to fashion stone artifacts by grinding, a technology that persisted throughout later millennia and was markedly different from that used in the Aleutians. The first residents of the winter-freezing coasts of the north appeared only after 3000 BCE, when people of the Arctic small tool tradition began to replace any northern archaic people who were exploiting the largely treeless lands immediately inland from the coasts. Predominantly terrestrial in subsistence orientation, hunting especially caribou and musk ox and taking river and lake fish, the people of the Arctic small tool tradition also exploited coastal resources on a seasonal basis. These people are thought to have been new immigrants from Neolithic Northeast Asia, as their material culture is characterized by diminutive stone artifacts similar to those found in that region, albeit without the pottery that is usually found on Asian sites. Although leaving evidence of neither sleds nor boats, by 2500 BCE the descendants of the small tool people had exploded across the Arctic archipelago of Canada to northernmost Greenland, in some areas turning more and more to coastal resources. At about the same time, they also expanded within Alaska south to the Alaska Peninsula, where their southern limit coincided with that of heavy winter coastal drift ice and intruded in some limited areas to the North Pacific itself near Cook Inlet. Within a few centuries they moved also into the tundra-covered barren grounds west of Hudson Bay, displacing earlier peoples who had exploited barren grounds caribou. Along the northeastern coast of the continent, they penetrated southward as far as the Gulf of St. Lawrence, again to the southern edge of heavy winter sea ice. In northern Canada and Greenland the small tool folk gradually developed into those of the Dorset culture, who by 800 BCE had created techniques for hunting seals through their breathing holes in winter sea ice and developed substantial dwellings of sod and rocks that they heated with lamps of sea mammal oil. In some areas the Dorset culture is thought to have persisted until about 1300 CE. In Alaska the material culture of the small tool people was replaced by that of the Norton culture in approximately 500 BCE. These people made pottery similar to that found in contemporary Siberia, and their substantial villages of semi-subterranean houses appeared along the coast from the Bering Sea to the Beaufort Sea, near the present northern border of Alaska with Canada. Norton people hunted sea mammals in open water. Some of their harpoons were large enough for whaling, as well as interior animals, including caribou. They also took lake and river fish. On much of the Alaska mainland, people of the Norton tradition endured until the end of the first millennium CE, a period when other major developments were taking place in the islands and on the Asian coast near the Bering Strait. In the area around the strait, an increasing ability to hunt in the open sea led to the development of the Northern Maritime, or Thule, cultural tradition. In this area the tradition is recognizable by 200 CE and in some cases perhaps a century or two earlier. It is characterized by ground slate tools, ivory harpoon heads, often decoratively engraved, lamps made of clay or mud, and a heavy reliance on sea mammals. By c. 700 CE the ancestral Thule people, or their culture, had expanded into Alaska north of the Bering Strait, where by 900 to 1000 CE the mature Thule culture, or Thule proper, appeared. Thule culture proved to be the most adaptable of the Arctic, expanding rapidly to the coasts of Alaska, the eastern Chukchi Peninsula of Asia, and up the rivers of the Alaska mainland. This culture's use of the large open-skin boat, or umiak, for walrus and whale hunting, the kayak for sealing, and the dog sled for winter land transportation enabled the people to increase their subsistence options and geographic range. After 1000 CE, perhaps moving in pursuit of whales, whose locations were shifting due to changing ice conditions, they moved rapidly across northernmost Canada to Greenland. In these areas, they established new settlements of stone and sod houses at key locations while also displacing or absorbing the thinly scattered Dorset descendants of the small Thule people. The Canadian Thule culture carried the Inuit language to Greenland, while Thule-related groups in Alaska spread forms of the closely related Yupiit language around the Bering Sea coast and to the North Pacific. For the next few centuries a warming climate reduced the formation of winter pack ice. Most Arctic communities relied on excursions inland for caribou, river and lake fish, and other resources during the short summer months. Some people also pursued whales during those animals' migrations, and all of them made use of resources such as non-migratory seals in both summer and winter. After about 1400 CE, a period of increasing cold caused the peoples of northern Canada to give up permanent winter settlements, shifting instead to a nomadic seasonal round. This typically included warm-weather caribou hunting and river fishing, activities during which people lived in tents, and cold-weather seal hunting through the sea ice, at the animals' breathing holes, undertaken while people resided in snow houses, essentially the way of life that many people now think of as characteristic of all traditional Inuit peoples. Because the climate shift was less extreme in areas closer to the coasts of the Pacific, including the Bering Sea and Atlantic Oceans, communities in those areas perpetuated the stable oceanside life established in the Thule period, building permanent dwellings of sod, logs, and stones. They rarely used snow houses except during winter travel, and they hunted through the sea ice chiefly in times of winter famine when stores of other foods had been exhausted. Traditional cultures. The traditional cultures of this region are generally discussed in terms of two broad divisions: seasonally migratory peoples living on or near winter-frozen coastlines, the northern Yupiit and the Inuit, and more sedentary groups living on or near the open water regions of the Pacific coast, the southern Yupiit and Unangan. Seasonally migratory peoples, the northern Yupiit and the Inuit. The seasonally organized economy of these peoples derived from that of their Thule ancestors and focused on the exploitation of both sea and land resources. Traditional peoples generally followed the Thule subsistence pattern, in which summers were spent in pursuit of caribou and fish and other seasons were devoted to the pursuit of sea mammals, especially seals. Food was also stored for consumption during the deepest part of winter. There were exceptions to this pattern, however. People of the Bering Strait Islands, for instance, depended almost entirely on sea mammals, walrus being very important. In the specialized Alaskan whaling villages between the Seward Peninsula and Point Barrow, caribou and seals were outweighed as food resources by bowhead whales. In the Brooks Range of northern Alaska, some people were year-round caribou hunters who also depended on traded sea mammal oil as a condiment and for heat. In the Barren Grounds, west of Hudson Bay, some groups used no sea products at all, illuminating their snow houses with burning caribou fat and heating these homes with twig fires. Most shelter in winter was in substantial semi-subterranean houses of stone or sod over wooden or whalebone frameworks. In Alaska, save for the far north, heat was provided by a central wood fire that was placed beneath a smoke hole. Throughout the north and in Greenland, a large sea mammal oil lamp served the same purpose. In 19th century Siberia and on St. Lawrence Island, the older semi-subterranean house was given up for a yurt-like structure with sod walls and a walrus hide roof. In winter the people nearest the Arctic Ocean relied on the snow house, generally referred to as an igloo, igloo or igluvigak, depending on dialect, with most groups moving onto fresh ice fields in search of seals during that season. Caribou hunters and lake and river fishermen used the snow house on land. The caribou specialists of northern Alaska often lived through the winter in double-layered dome-shaped tents, heated like the coastal snow houses with an oil lamp. These dwellings commonly housed an extended family. In east and west Greenland, communal dwellings were built of stone, housed as many as 50 people from different kin groups, and were arranged such that each nuclear family had its own interior space and oil lamp. Communities in the far north of Greenland chose to use smaller stone houses designed to shelter nuclear families. Among the Yupiit, a special large semi-subterranean house, called a kashim by the Russians, was used for public and ceremonial occasions and as a men's residence. The kashim was the place where men built their boats, repaired their equipment, took sweat baths, educated young boys, and hosted community dances. Women had their own homes in which they worked and cared for their children. In many cases the women's homes were connected to one another and to the kashim by a system of tunnels, not all of them generally known. A number of folktales tell how canny women saved their families from raids by directing them to hidden tunnels that opened far away from the village. The institution of the kashim was stronger to the south of the Bering Strait than to its north. Kashims did not exist on St. Lawrence Island or in Siberia, nor were they found east of Point Barrow until the late 19th or early 20th century, when they began to be used by Inuit living near the Mackenzie River. Both the single cockpit kayak and the larger open umiak were virtually universal, although they were not used the same way everywhere. The kayak was generally used as a seal hunting craft, but, in the places where open water sealing was limited, it was used to intercept migrating caribou as they crossed lakes and rivers. The umiak was usually a freight vessel, often rowed by women facing backward, but in whaling and walrus hunting regions it was used as a hunting boat and paddled by a male crew facing forward. Winter transport was by sled, pulled by dogs or by both dogs and people. In most regions the number of sled dogs, which ate the same food as humans and thus were a burden in times of want, was limited, an exception being the few areas in which relative plenty was provided by whales or migrating salmon. The bow and arrow were the standard tools of land hunters. Seals and walrus were taken from shore with a thrown harpoon tipped with a targeling head, an asymmetrical point with a line affixed, shaped to twist sidewise in the wound as the detachable shaft pulled loose. Kayak-based seal hunters used specialized harpoons with fixed barbs rather than targeling heads. These were often cast with the spearthrower or throwing board, a flat trough of wood that cradled the butt of the dart and formed an extension of the thrower's arm, increasing the velocity of the thrown projectile. The whaling umiak was manned by a professional crew. It was directed by the boat's owner, or umialik, and a marksman who wielded a heavy harpoon with a detachable targeling head and line attached to sealskin floats. In Quebec, whales were harpooned from kayaks or run aground in shallow bays. The flexibility of movement required by the seasonally varied subsistence quest was supported by the flexible organization of society. Individuals obtained psychological and material support from their kindred and tended to avoid people who were not kin, but there were devices for creating kin-like relationships that could extend the social and territorial sphere in which an individual could move in safety and comfort. These included a variety of institutionalized relationships. People bearing the same name as a relative might be treated as if they held the same relation, and trading partners, song partners, meat-sharing partners, and partners created by the temporary exchange of spouses might also be treated approximately as relatives. Generally, American Inuit recognized kin on both the paternal and maternal sides of the family to about the degree of second cousin. Marriage with cousins was frowned upon by most groups, although permitted by some. Certain groups also emphasized paternal kin over maternal. On St. Lawrence Island and in Siberia, however, there were patrilineal clans, named groups of all people related in the male line. In Siberia, marriage could not be contracted by two members of the same clan, although on St. Lawrence such a rule was not enforced. There the walrus and whale hunting crews were composed of clansmen. The senior male became clan chief, and the chief of the strongest local clan acted as the village chief. Among other groups there was no formal position of chief, the closest to an exception being the Umialik of the Yupiit. In addition to owning the boat used for whaling, the Umialik was the employer of a whaling crew, recruiting his men for their professional ability and acting as benefactor to them and their families. In many villages each Umialik and his crew controlled a kashim. The title of Umialik was also used in some villages not devoted to whaling, especially in the northern Alaskan interior, where the Umialik was the organizer of a caribou hunting team. The position of Umialik was not inherited but was gained by skilled entrepreneurs, and it brought no control over anyone but the Umialik's own crew, and then only to the extent that an individual chose to remain a crew member. Religious beliefs were based on animism. All things, animate or otherwise, were believed to have a living essence. Thus, all humans, animals, plants, and objects had souls or spirits, which might be related to one another in a hereafter, details of the location of which varied from group to group. Courtesies given to freshly killed animals promoted their reincarnation as new animals of the same species. The souls of humans were subject to interference from other spirits, and soul loss meant illness or even death. There also were ideas of human reincarnation. The name of a deceased person was given to a child who became that person by being addressed with kinship terms appropriate to the deceased. Traditionally, all people were in contact with the spirit world. They carried amulets of traditional or individual potency, experienced dreams, devised songs or other words of power, and achieved special relationships with particular spirit beings. Men and women who were especially adept at such contact became shamans. They were called on to cure the sick by recovering lost soul stuff, to foretell the future, to determine the location of game, and so forth, all with the help of powerful spirit familiars. Shamans were also expected to contact a few more strongly personified spirit beings, such as the female being, whose name and attributes varied from group to group, who governed important land or sea mammals. When game was scarce, the shaman might cajole her into providing more bounty. In Greenland the shaman was also an entertainer whose seances, escape tricks, and noisy spirit helpers could enliven a long winter's night in the communal house. Sedentary peoples, the southern Yupiit and the Unangan. These groups made use of the sod-covered and semi-subterranean house, the skin-covered kayak and the umiak, and fishing and hunting apparatus similar to those of the northern Yupiit and the Inuit. Yet, like many neighboring northwest coast Indians, they focused almost exclusively on aquatic resources and had a hierarchical society comprising formal chiefs, apparently inherited in the male line, other elites, commoners, and a class of enslaved people that was generally composed of war captives. Although the Yupik-speaking people of the Kodiak region maintained kashims that seemed to have functioned generally like those of the north and were said to be owned by local chiefs, the Unangam Tunu, Aleut-speaking groups had no similar structure. Unfortunately, the region's conquest by Russian fur hunters eradicated many details of indigenous life before they could be thoroughly recorded. Historical developments. The European colonization of the American Arctic flowed inland from the coasts of Greenland, Kalallit Nunaat, southern and southwestern Alaska, and the Arctic Ocean and Hudson Bay. The discussions below consider these major areas of colonization in turn. Greenland of the Arctic. Eric the Red founded a small Norse colony on Greenland, Kalallit Nunaat, in 986 CE, although the Norse and the Thule people seem not to have interacted until the 13th century. The Norse colony was abandoned in the early 15th century, a time when a general climatic cooling trend probably made subsistence farming unsustainable there. European fishermen built seasonally used base camps on Greenland's southern coasts during the 16th and 17th centuries. During the periods of European absence, Inuit people sometimes burned the seemingly abandoned buildings in order to simplify the collection of iron nails and metal fittings. These were easily transformed into implements that proved more durable than traditional stone tools. This destruction of fishing camps created tensions between the Europeans and the Inuit. The group sometimes fought, but there were apparently no attempts at political domination. In 1721 a permanent Danish-Norwegian colony was founded on Greenland. Its goals were missionization and trade. Unusually, the region's indigenous peoples were from the first treated as full citizens of the kingdom. Epidemics of European diseases struck almost immediately, killing as many as one-third of the people on the island. In 1776 the Danish government granted a trade monopoly to the Royal Greenlandic Trading Company. With the restriction of contact with outsiders, losses to epidemic disease were greatly reduced. Denmark retained a trading monopoly with Greenland until 1951. Indigenous languages remained in general use after colonization. Because missionaries often learned Inuit while residing in Nuuk, now the capital city, and then left for more distant locales, the Nuuk dialect came into common use throughout Greenland. This helped create a sense of ethnic unity among indigenous Greenlanders, and that unity continued to grow with the 1861 publication of the first Inuit language newspaper. By the late 19th century, Greenland's indigenous peoples had created a significant and growing vernacular literature and a name for their shared identity, Kalaalleq. By the 21st century the terms Kalalit, West Greenlanders, Inuguit, from Thule district, and Lit, East Greenlanders, had come into usage by the indigenous people, who call their homeland Kalalit Nunaat, now Greenland's official name. In 1862 Greenland was granted limited local self-government. In the period from 1905 to 1929, its residents shifted from a traditional subsistence economy to sheep breeding and cod fishing. Although hunting remained important in the early 21st century, schools began to teach Danish. In 1953, after more than 200 years as a colony, Greenland became an integral part of Denmark and gained representation in the National Legislative Assembly. In 1979 it achieved complete home rule under the Greenland Home Rule Act. The Inuit Institute, Greenland's first institution of higher education, was formed in 1983. In 1989 it was reorganized as a university, Ilisimatusarfik, and became one of the few institutions dedicated to the study of Kalaalleq traditional cultures and languages. Within Greenland, university training in other subjects is still limited, as younger Kalaalleq commonly speak Danish as a second language. Many enroll in Danish universities. Southern and southwestern Alaska. In 1728 the Russian Tsar Peter I, the Great, supported an expedition to the northern Pacific. Led by Vitus Bering, the expedition set out to determine whether Siberia and North America were connected and, if not, whether there was a navigable sea route connecting the commercial centers of western Russia to China. Although poor visibility limited the results of this voyage, subsequent Russian journeys determined that the Pacific coast of North America was home to a seemingly inexhaustible population of sea otters. Russian entrepreneurs quickly seized on the opportunity to garner sea otter pelts, known for their lush feel and superior insulating qualities, as these were at the time almost the only items for which the Chinese were willing to engage in trade with Russia. Russian rule was established in the region quickly and often brutally. Perhaps the worst atrocities occurred in 1745, when a large party of Russian and Siberian hunters overwintered in the Aleutian Islands. Members of the party engaged in wholesale murder and sexual assault, for which they were later charged in the Russian courts and punished. Similar incidents of violent conquest occurred throughout the region, and over the next several decades the indigenous population was forced into virtual slavery. Russian administrators recognized indigenous expertise in capturing sea otters and so negotiated with the hunters during the first part of the colonial era, albeit on an unequal basis given the colonizers' imposing firepower. However, these more or less voluntary levels of fur production proved inadequate for commercial trading. By 1761 the Russians had instituted a village-based quota system. They remained unsatisfied with the results and soon took entire villages hostage as a way to ensure the docility of Anangaks, Aleut, and Yupiit men, nearly all of whom were impressed into service as hunters. This created intense hardship for the elders, women, and children left behind. Hunting had provided most of their subsistence, and, with the hunters away or exhausted, many communities suffered from malnourishment or starvation in addition to the epidemic diseases that characterized European conquest throughout the Americas. Within a century of initial contact, the Anangam Chunu, Aleut-speaking population had declined to no more than 2,000, at least 80% of their original number were gone. Around Kodiak Island and the Pacific coast, the decrease in roughly the same period was to about 3,000, a loss of about two-thirds. On the Bering Sea, where the fur trade was less intense, the loss was limited to about one-third or one-half of the population, all of it coming in the 19th century. In 1799 the Russian-American Company was granted what amounted to governance of the Russian colonies in the North Pacific. The company undertook a period of expansion and eventually ruled thousands of miles of coast, from the Bering Sea to northern California. Russian Orthodox missionaries arrived at about the same time. They observed the brutalities committed against indigenous peoples, reported these to the Tsar, and worked to ameliorate the horrendous conditions in the hostage villages. Although protective language was placed in the company's second charter, enforcement was haphazard. Nonetheless, and perhaps because the priests were clearly their advocates, many Yunangan and Yupiit converted to Orthodox Christianity. The US government purchased Russian America in 1867 and subsequently imposed its assimilationist policies on Alaskan natives. Various forms of pressure were applied to ensure that indigenous communities shifted from subsistence to wage labor, from the use of their own languages to English, and from Russian Orthodox traditions to mainline Protestantism, among other things. As elsewhere in the United States, these policies undermined indigenous traditions and generally caused local economies to shift from self-sufficiency and sustainability to a reliance on outside capital. As the sea otter neared extinction, some Yupiat and Anangax communities shifted to the hunting of other fur-bearing mammals, such as seals and Arctic foxes. As among the neighboring Northwest Coast Indians, other groups used their knowledge of local fisheries to ensure employment. These strategies met with various levels of success, but the indigenous communities often faced circumstantial difficulties. Demand for furs collapsed during the Great Depression of the 1930s, and fishermen had to cope with natural cycles in the population levels of various kinds of fish, the vagaries of consumer taste, and competition from better-equipped Euro-Americans. By the mid-20th century, international politics were also affecting large numbers of indigenous Alaskans. World War II saw the removal of whole Alaskan Native communities under the aegis of protection and national defense. After the war, having in some cases endured years of difficult, temporary conditions, those who returned to their homes found them in disrepair and in some cases ransacked. The Cold War ensured that the military presence in Alaska would continue to grow until the late 20th century. New facilities were often placed on property that indigenous groups used and regarded as their own, creating further hardships. Canada and northern Alaska. The region from the Bering Strait northward and east to the Mackenzie River was untouched by Russians, but after the mid-19th century it was visited by great numbers of European and Euro-American whalers, who imported both disease and alcohol. The indigenous population declined by two-thirds or more between 1850 and 1910. In far northern Canada the impact was lessened somewhat, for contact was limited and the thinly distributed populations more easily avoided the spread of disease. Nevertheless, European whalers active in Hudson Bay and elsewhere were a source of disease and disruption that resulted in a significant decline in indigenous population in the 19th century. Intensive whaling, and later the hunting of walruses, depleted some of the major food sources of far northern communities and in some cases created localized hardship. However, whalers often recognized the technical skills of the northern Yupiat and the Inuit and arranged for various kinds of partnership. A Euro-American might reside with a local family for a winter, gaining food, shelter, and company while the family would gain labor-saving technology, such as metal knives, steel needles, and rifles. Widespread difficulties arose with the imposition of assimilationist policies by the United States and Canada and later, after the discovery of gold, oil, and mineral resources in the region. By the late 19th century, church-sponsored experiments in reindeer herding were promoting assimilation in northern Alaska. These ventures generally failed due to their incompatibility with the local culture. People were accustomed to moving widely across the landscape but also had the habit of returning frequently to their home communities, a practice that quickly caused overgrazing near settlements. In addition, Euro-American entrepreneurs generally had enough capital to crowd out indigenous reindeer operations. Gold strikes on Canada's Klondike River in 1896 and near Nome, Alaska, in 1898 shifted attention away from indigenous economic development, incidentally providing many northern Alaskan natives with a welcome opportunity to return to traditional modes of subsistence. As in western and southwestern Alaska, the northern parts of Alaska and Canada saw an increase in military facilities during and after World War II. By the 1950s and 60s, concerns about environmental degradation and land seizures caused Alaskan natives to file lawsuits to halt the development of oil and other resources. These suits eventually led to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, in which the United States agreed to provide to Alaskan Natives some $962.5 million and 44 million acres of land, all to be administered through indigenous-run corporations. For administrative purposes and to encourage local development, the state was divided among 12 regional indigenous corporations, 7 of them Inuit or Yupiit, 1 Anangax, and the rest Native American, First Nations, each including a series of village corporations in which individual indigenous persons were sole shareholders. A 13th corporation serves Alaskan Natives who reside outside the state. The corporations have promoted housing, local schools, satellite communications facilities, medical facilities, and programs directed at alcohol abuse and have provided a training ground for indigenous politicians active in state government, where they represent an increasingly sophisticated indigenous citizenry. Canada did not seek direct rule over the northern coastal region until the early 20th century, and the Canadian Inuit have had the same opportunities to vote and hold office as other Canadians only since about 1960, a time that coincides with the creation of increasingly stable settlements, the extension of social welfare, a decline in the importance of the traditional hunting economy, and the beginnings of indigenous organizations that seek the recognition of the Inuit as a distinct people with rights of self-governance and to lands and traditional culture. Canada's Inuit proved quite adept at effecting political change. In the mid-1970s, the province of Quebec took from the Dominion government all political responsibility for relationships with Inuit residing there. Inuit communities soon organized into village corporations with defined rights to land and resources. At about the same time, the Northwest Territories elected people of Indigenous descent to a majority of the 15 seats then in the Territorial Legislative Assembly. In 1979, the first Inuit was elected to one of the 2 Northwest Territories seats in the National House of Commons. A proposal to divide the Northwest Territories into 2 parts, the eastern to include the major Inuit territory, was submitted to a plebiscite in 1982. The proposal won heavily in the east but only narrowly overall. It eventually passed, and what had been the eastern part of the Northwest Territories became the territory of Nunavut in 1999.